Have you ever experienced sleep paralysis?
Have you ever had a near-death experience?
Have you ever talked to someone who has recently passed on?
Well, I can tell you about 70% of combat veterans have had one or more of these experiences. And even in the civilian population, they are all widespread, common, and normal.
We are here with Ben Glenn, Richard's older brother, and Dr. David Hufford, who is an expert in all of these categories. Get into it. It's a fascinating subject.
Check it out.
Hi, I'm Luke,
I'm Richard.
and this is the Spiritable Podcast.
We're having conversations about big spiritual, moral, and social issues in hopefully a more grounded way.
We talk a lot from the religious philosophy of this guy, Emanuel Swedenborg, and our own twist on Christianity. Check out episode 9 for more on that.
But of course, we don't have all the answers, so we like to bring on guests with their own philosophies
Muslim, Jewish, Buddhist, atheist, etc.
to help get new perspectives and to challenge each other's beliefs.
Everyone has some relationship with spirituality, but for some dumb reason it can be hard to talk about.
And everyone's experience with life is going to be a little different, and that's what makes it so interesting.
So, thanks for joining us on Spiritable.
So we are joined here by Dr. David Hufford, who is retired, semi-retired?
Retired.
Retired fully, congratulations.
Congrats.
From Penn State Medical School. We're going to talk about some fun things later, and we also have Ben Glenn here. Oh,
Glenn.
familiar last name.
Yeah.
How's that connect?
So this is Ben. Ben, say hi to our audience.
Hello, audience.
Ben is my older brother. He is a year behind me in the theological school program.
So the quality of our content is just...
It's gonna plummet, guys. You know, this
Bringing
all this
the
sage
average
wisdom.
down.
But yeah, so Ben will be, as you, the audience, know, for a couple of weeks we've been saying that I will be leaving for a while. I'm going on my practicum for a couple months, and while I'm gone, my brother here will be filling in. So if I look different next week, it's him.
Slightly less
You have to start
ginger.
growing your goatee there, Ben.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we need at least one goatee on the podcast.
It's true. So we're passing the torch this episode to Ben over here.
Yeah.
So it'll be fun.
I'm excited.
All right. Well, Ben, do you want to give your background at all before we jump into Dr. Hufford's background?
I mean, it's pretty much the same background as Richard's.
Yeah.
So they've heard it all before. It's just
That's
Richard,
true.
but 4 years older.
You had some work and life experience, before
Okay, sure.
theological school.
Yeah. Well, I graduated college in 2013 with a degree in religion. Yeah, it's been a lifelong goal of mine to enter the ministry ever since I was 16 or so. And I finally got around to doing it after, lots and lots of way too much thinking.
Would you say, was it fear holding you back from joining straight away? I never really heard that.
It wasn't fear so much. Well, it was being a 20-year-old and not being so sure about everything.
Fair enough.
So I had to, let my life crash and burn a little bit and then sort of build it back up, and then finally I was ready.
I feel like there's wisdom in there.
Yeah, maybe. We'll see.
Nice. Well, I'm
see how
pumped
it
to have
turns
you.
To be determined.
And Dr. Hufford, I'm going to try to summarize your life here, so I'm going to do a terrible job. But I want to really jump into the recent study that you've been doing, which I think is going to be somewhat of a focus of what we talk about. So I'm going to try to go through your history pretty quickly here.
Feel free to heckle him
Yeah.
when he gets
Oh, I
anything
will.
wrong.
If you have tomatoes, you can just take them out and throw them at me. So you taught and went to Penn State Medical School, correct?
No, I did not go.
Did not
Penn-
go?
No, I did my graduate
terrible
training
start.
at University of Pennsylvania. I taught at Penn State's
at
Medical
Penn State.
School from
Right.
1974 till 2007.
Nice. Wow. That's a good tenure there. So you graduated grad school in the 1960s, and in that time sort of had a dislike of the academic and medical attitude towards spirituality. I remember jotting that
Yes,
down.
dislike might be too strong. I was critical of it. I felt that it showed a lack of respect for widespread spiritual ideas and people's descriptions of really interesting experiences they said they'd had.
Fantastic. Yeah, and I remember you mentioning that you'd also kind of had a critique of the stigma associated from psych diagnosis, which was harmful to spiritual conversation. As
Absolutely.
Well, which I enjoyed hearing.
In fact, I knew that what I was going to be looking at on undertaking the study of what we now call extraordinary spiritual experiences, which are spiritual experiences that are perceptual experiences of what appears to be a spiritual reality, as opposed to what we call ordinary spiritual experiences or everyday spiritual experiences, which are ordinary experiences interpreted spiritually. So beautiful sunset, makes me grateful to God for the beauty of nature. That's an ordinary spiritual experience.
Would you call the gathering of these fellows an ordinary spiritual experience? That
This-
fate aligned in such a way to bring us
Yeah,
together?
definitely. Absolutely. An ordinary but special spiritual experience, as opposed to, for example, a near-death experience.
Right.
Where a person has an experience of leaving their body. You might call that becoming a spirit, encountering dead people they know, being met by a being of light. That is not an interpretation of an ordinary experience. It's an experience that makes a claim about something real, about the world, that is beyond our ordinary material landscape.
Yeah, and from what we talked about, it sounds like you set out to find the sort of universal spiritual experiences that people would encounter across culturally, such as near-death experiences, sleep
Well,
paralysis.
at the beginning, I didn't know actually that there were universal ones. I saw similar themes cross-culturally.
Right.
But because most scholars who have looked at these things, whether they're theologians, anthropologists, or whoever, describe these things in sort of general terms. They kind of sum them up. And they don't go into what I would call sort of a careful, phenomenological, detailed description. That is the kind of thing you would want to know if you were trying to understand something you believed a person had really seen. And because scholars have, for a long time in the modern world, thought that although for us empiricists, seeing is believing, that for people who believe in stuff like this, believing is seeing, that you have to believe it first and then you will see it. So the descriptions tend to be general, difficult to compare, and people don't do a lot of cross-cultural comparison on these things. So it was sort of a more basic question that I asked. I asked, to what extent might widespread spiritual beliefs have extraordinary spiritual beliefs? So, for example, a belief in ghosts. We find belief in ghosts all over the world.
Right.
So that's definitely a universal kind of belief. Well, we've got all kinds of explanations of why people would believe those silly things. I wanted to ask, to what extent might this widespread belief in spirits of that sort be empirically founded? And might the conclusions people reach from that be rationally derived? Because the standard scholarly assumption is we call these things non-rational, non-empirical. I mean, that's in the literature all over the place. That was what sort of offended me, because I thought, I really don't believe that ordinary people are really non-empirical and non-rational. They wouldn't live as long as they do if they walked around in the world that way.
So did you find your most empirical data leading you towards sleep paralysis and the spiritual
sleep paralysis,
associations thereof?
yeah,
because that was your book.
Yeah,
was about sleep paralysis.
The book is about sleep paralysis, and actually, what led me to sleep paralysis was having it myself in 1964. I'd never heard of anything like it
until you had it.
Until I had it. Wow. I was in college, and I woke up during the night. I heard the door to my room open. I was in an off-campus rental place. I was the only tenant there, although I had a landlord who lived downstairs. Yeah, and so I heard the door open. I thought, I wonder if maybe somebody's coming in to see if I want to go to dinner over at the Student Union building. So I tried to turn on the light, and that's when I realized I was paralyzed. I heard footsteps shuffling across the floor, and I felt the bed go down on one side as something climbed up, and I felt it press on my chest, sort of like
and you couldn't open your eyes?
Well, I think I had my eyes open, but the room was pitch dark. I'd put the shades down. I had all the lights off upstairs, so there was nothing I could see. But the other thing I felt was a sense of revulsion, a sense of intense evil. This thing, if I could have turned on the light and found out it was just a murderer about to cut my throat, I would have said, "Oh, good," because instead this felt more like I had some kind of horrible spider or something is on me. And I didn't have any. It's not like it had 8 legs or something. It's just the sense of repulsion was terrible. As soon as I finally moved my hand, it was over. I jumped up. I turned on the light. I was sure I was awake. I ran downstairs. The landlord looked at me like I was crazy and said, "No, nobody came through here." And so I thought, okay, I'll never tell anybody. That was 1964. 6 years later, with that partially being my reason for wondering about other stories, other people's stories
Opens the door
like
to
this.
your curiosity.
Yeah. I went to Newfoundland, Canada to do my doctoral dissertation fieldwork. I was in graduate school at Penn. And in Newfoundland, it turned out that they knew all about this. Happened all the time in Newfoundland. They called it there the old hag, which is a very old term that was used to refer to it as something caused possibly by witchcraft. It's not that the thing in the room was feminine in particular,
Right.
hag in that sense. But anyway, they said it happened a lot. And now I had been taught that when you hear these narratives, it doesn't necessarily mean anybody ever actually themselves had this experience. Well, I knew in this case at least one person who had this experience, and I'm thinking, why do they know about my experience?
Yeah.
So I did a survey, and 18% of my sample there in Newfoundland said it had happened to them.
Really?
Yeah. And they
What
were
was the
sure-
age range of people you surveyed?
We
varied?
know now it's sort of across the age range. I started with a sample of university students, and it was 18% of them.
Wow.
But every group that I hit was roughly 18%.
Was this just a pastime at this point in your life? Or was
No,
this...
no. I had gone to Newfoundland to look at supernatural belief,
Okay.
and I wanted to do it with questions about experience. How does experience relate to these beliefs?
Right.
And I did it with a critical sense of the theories that I had been taught in graduate school. So, and that got more critical when I found that these people all had my experience, or I'd
Right.
had their experience.
Right. And it makes sense that you lead with your own experience as well, because it's something you've had.
Although I never, and in fact, I know, Ben, you've started reading my book. At the time I wrote the book, published at University of Pennsylvania Press, 1982, I did not mention that it had happened to me.
Oh, really?
Did that
And
come from
why?
self-consciousness?
No, it came from wanting to be credible.
Oh, that's fair.
On a lot of intense, interesting things, you get credibility by saying, I have had this experience. I know about this. But if what you want to talk about is something that most people in the academic world consider to be a symptom of psychotic illness, you don't want to say, I've had this. Not so
Very
much
fair.
because I thought that I would be put away, but because I thought that people would say, oh, this is something that happened to him, that's why he's talking about it. And he says other people had it. I never heard anybody talk about that. No, I just wanted to present data, which is what I do in the book.
Like you were worried that people would figure you were interpreting the data a certain way
Yeah,
to match
absolutely.
your
Right.
experience.
Yeah, that's right, that it would produce a bias. I don't know that it didn't produce a bias, but the data on this stuff
clear.
is so overwhelming that you really don't have to be concerned about that. I came back, I started doing surveys and interviewing people ethnographically in the area of the medical school, including my medical students. Same 18% as in Newfoundland.
Really?
Medical students. And now, in terms of sleep paralysis, loss of sleep can make it somewhat more likely. So college students toward the end of a semester,
They're sleep
which was what had
deprived, cramming
happened
for
to
an
me.
exam.
Yeah, and because this is a form of REM breakthrough, rapid eye movement sleep breakthrough, then loss of sleep makes it more likely to happen. Now, it's very important that having said that, and I do say this is sleep paralysis. Sleep paralysis does not explain this. It's sort of like, yes, many near-death experiences happen when people are in cardiac arrest. We don't say, oh, well, of course they left their body and watched themselves be resuscitated while being with God and meeting their deceased relatives in heaven. They were in cardiac arrest. No, that is not an explanation of near-death experiences. It's a common context, and it presumably has something to do with the trigger. But actually, that trigger, in terms of near-death experiences, should make all of the things in a near-death experience less likely, not more.
Yeah.
And even though this thing, the paralysis, is a REM-related phenomenon, if it were just scary, since after all you are paralyzed, if it was just scary, but you got, you interview 10 people about it, you get 10 different stories, you would say, well, this is a breakthrough of bad dreams into wakefulness. it's when they all talk about the door opening and the feet shuffling and saying, sounds like they took off their shoes. It's never a hard footsteps kind of sound. And the sense of evil. And I'm talking about Thailand, Indonesia, the high Arctic among the Inuit. I'm talking about medieval Sweden. I'm talking about my medical students. You get that kind of cross-cultural distribution, you know something's going on.
Well, I'm curious how the 18% fits in here. Ben, have you ever had any form of sleep paralysis?
No, I haven't.
Other Ben?
I have had sleep paralysis before. I've never experienced the evil presence.
You're lucky.
But
yeah, 20% of the paralysis experiences don't have the presence. So it's not always there.
What was your experience like?
it was when I was really young, like maybe 11. I just remember waking up just staring at my ceiling but not being able to move a single muscle in my body. And I remember sitting there just freaking out internally because I thought my body just did not work anymore. And trying to like use anything I had to shift my weight. I remember like gaining a little bit of traction wiggling, and that was as much as I got.
What
and then
broke
I
you
just
through?
like gave up and went back to sleep and was fine in the morning.
Oh my gosh.
It was real scary.
What about you?
No, I've never had anything like that.
Oh, interesting. I have one experience I wanted to see if, because I don't know if I can qualify as sleep paralysis because I don't know if I could move or not. Because I woke up and I was too scared to move.
Oh, I hear that. And I call that behavioral paralysis. We don't know whether you're in loss of muscle tone, which is what REM breakthrough does to you. It's hard to tell.
Yeah.
But what caused the fear?
Well, I don't know. I remember
That's
I was well, I was asleep and I woke up just immediately in a cold sweat, just petrified. I didn't hear anything. I didn't see anything. My eyes were closed, but I just knew there was something like right in front of me. And so I sat there just frozen for probably a good 5 minutes, and then there was a lamp at the foot of my bed, and then I just like almost was psyching myself up, like sat up really quick, turned the light on, looked around, and everything was fine. And probably half an hour later, I was able to go back to sleep with the light on.
Yeah.
But
How old were you?
This happened recently, right? This was like 6 months ago or so?
No. That was it was when I was still in Stewart Hall, so it was like a year.
Okay.
Year and some ago, a year and 3 months maybe.
Okay.
But as an adult.
Yes, as
You
an
weren't
adult.
like
I was
an
I was
11-year-old or
23,
something,
probably.
Okay, so among the four of us, half of us, two of us out of the four have had it. And that definitely counts. I mean, when you give me the sense of threatening presence,
Oh my gosh. the
that
most I've ever
together
felt.
with not moving, that's very, very characteristic. And
Sorry, Richard, you had a question.
Yeah, I had a question for you. So with cases of sleep paralysis, do you know how often in cases of sleep paralysis there is this very similar story, and how many cases are like Ben's story of just the kind of the paralysis?
Or mine, where
as
I
I
didn't
said,
hear anything.
about 80% are with the presence.
Wow.
The great majority are with the presence. And we have about 25 years ago, the Roper Polling Organization did a national survey on this, random, across the country, and they found 18%.
Wow.
I mean, and the question was,
So you were
have
like,
you ever...
I knew it first.
Oh, they knew I
Read
knew
my
it
book
first.
over here.
It was because of my work that they wound up doing it.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. But, there's no question about this being quite prevalent all over the world and convincingly real. And also no question that it frequently, very frequently, as with all extraordinary spiritual experiences, has been used to diagnose illness, which is not correct. It is not a symptom of illness. It's, who knows what it is.
Yeah. Well, I think there's...
But it is the basis of, and it's funny that I got to start at this end of things, because like if you start with the near-death experiences, well, that's very nice stuff. And whether
Yeah,
people
it's
believe it
pleasant.
or not, they say, oh, that's pretty cool. That's cool. Evil spiritual experiences are much more verboten in the modern world in terms of considering them rationally grounded than beautiful spiritual experiences are. Although, once again, we would say the impression of folks all over the world is that there are both kinds of spiritual experiences. And you could, if we had time, we could go through a little catalog of the evil things that people have in tradition said do these things to people.
What
very
they
much
term them or whatever.
Yeah.
But Richard, I feel like you've had a question.
Yeah,
here.
well, just the concept of spiritual experiences has always been one that's really fascinating to me. I think it's probably has a higher fascination among people in my faith, in the New Church faith, because the big thing that sets us apart from other Christianity is the writings of Emanuel Swedenborg.
Yes, absolutely right.
So I think it was very much like a community interest that I always grew up with. So it's fascinating to hear like widespread empirical data about that happening. So you talked about before we started recording about working with victims of PTSD and their spiritual experiences.
That's a study of combat veterans that I finished the data gathering about 3 years ago. I hope to have it in press within a year.
So he's retired.
Well,
Over here.
I've got 4 kids at home too. I mean, I have a funny idea of what counts as retirement.
You seem happy, which is good.
I am happy. Well, I was working in a nonprofit organization, a medical research organization that does lots of work with the military. And I was a senior fellow in spirituality and health with that organization in Fredericksburg, Virginia. And they had a lot of Department of Defense funding. And I thought, well, I like doing this stuff, and now why not take a look at combat vets? For one thing, a quick look at the literature told me nobody's ever looked at this among veterans, or in terms of people who've been through combat. And yet, the circumstances of combat invite spiritual experience in a way. Trauma,
What do you mean? Yeah.
lots of death, pain, fear, loss of sleep. Okay, so I
Conducive
thought,
to that experience.
let's have a look at this. And I started out hoping to do it on some of the military bases where we had other studies going on. But when we approached the personnel, the people in charge on those bases, and they heard what our questions were about, they said, yeah, we can't really do that. That would be dangerous. Because if our folks say yes to those questions, they'll have to be referred to psychiatrists and evaluated. It'll be bad for their career. I was not at all surprised.
But this is recent too. Though. This is like
we're in
the
absolutely
21st century here.
Well, I've got a lot more evidence on that, because what I did in the study was to survey combat vets. I had to recruit them in the community because I couldn't do active service people because I couldn't use the people on the bases. I went through VFWs and personnel at clinics, one in Medical University of South Carolina, with a lot of veteran patients who were no longer active duty. So we recruited the veterans. We also recruited people who provided care to the veterans. And
I like that.
I wanted to answer questions about the prevalence of these experiences among combat veterans.
And by these experiences, you mean night terrors,
I got 3 of
NDEs?
them. Night terror, well, they're not night terrors, I'm sorry. Night terrors is a stage 4 thing, not related to REM.
Sleep paralysis?
So sleep paralysis, right. So sleep paralysis with a spiritual presence, the near-death experience, and after-death communication, in particular bereavement visits from deceased loved ones. Those are the 3 things that I selected.
3 big ones.
Yeah. And I wanted to look at characteristics I wanted to look at the prevalence and distribution of those experiences in this sample. And I wanted to see whether it would be associated with things that are conventional explanations. So the 3 things that I had several measures for out of a 27-page survey for everybody who was willing to do it.
Yeah.
I had measures of spirituality and religion, measures of education, and measures of responses to ordinary spiritual experiences. So the veteran sample in this study was substantially better educated, as we should expect with a veteran sample, than the general population of the U.S. They had all graduated high school. 80% of them had some college. Lots of them had degrees and graduate degrees. So substantially better educated. They were not significantly different from the general population or the care providers in terms of self-ranking of spirituality and religion, and it was slightly less than midway. So it was kind of like somewhat spiritual, somewhat religious. So they were not overly religious, or who knows what's overly, but not extremely religious. And they were very well educated. And on the measures, there's a standard scale for doing this, measures of interpreting ordinary experiences as spiritual. It's the daily spiritual experience scale. They were substantially below the general population of the U.S. in willingness to interpret ordinary experiences spiritually. So you would not expect this to be associated with high prevalence. But all three of the experiences are massively higher in the combat vets than in the general population.
Percentage-wise, what would you say?
Okay, so for sleep paralysis, the sleep paralysis is the least common of these. It is around 30% of the sample compared to 18%.
Wow.
Near-death experiences.
Right?
Near-death experiences are, I think it's about 38% of the sample. And that is compared to, among cardiac arrest survivors, typically we find closer to 20% or a little bit less. And communication with the deceased is 58%.
Oh my gosh.
The most frequent one. And many of those are comrades, as you might expect. So, and that means that you've got in the sample, 30% of the sample had never had any of these experiences. 70% had had one or two of the different varieties. 20% had had all three.
Wow.
So way up there. What causes that? Not lack of education, not hyper-religiosity, not an over-willingness to interpret things as being spiritually real. I do assume that the circumstances of combat make it more common. It's also the case that our study was entirely anonymous. If people said they would do it, we said, here's the survey. When you have it done, send it back. Don't put your name on it. No one will ever contact you about it. So we didn't do any follow-up, but we wanted people to know that they were perfectly safe in telling people about these experiences.
Yeah, so they didn't have your experience of, I'll never tell anyone about this.
That's right. They didn't have to. Now, in fact, I do think that many of these people were a little more willing to talk among themselves because the prevalence is so high. 70% of the population has had one or more of these. The likelihood of them chatting with each other about it is much higher than in the general population where the prevalence is so much lower.
Yeah.
So anyway, I had the providers also. And now the providers were no different from the combat vets in terms of their spirituality and religiosity. Obviously, they were also very well
educated.
Very well educated,
yeah.
Right. We gave them 6 vignettes. 3 of them were typical psychiatric vignettes. These are all, mostly these were psychologists, social workers, nurses, but people who provided some kind of therapeutic intervention. The provider, we gave them these 6 vignettes, so there are 3, like post-traumatic stress disorder flashback is an example of what we use for the standard ones. And then we gave them real vignettes from actual subjects who have been interviewed about a sleep paralysis with a presence, a near-death experience, and a visit from a deceased loved one. And they were all from combat veterans. So they should be characteristic, should be typical. So the providers, when you just look across the vignettes, they recognized, they were quite familiar with the conventional psychiatric symptoms. Their average rating on all 3 of the extraordinary spiritual experiences was between never heard of that or rarely have heard of that. We asked, how would you respond if you heard this? Would you reassure the patient? No one said they would reassure the patient. We said, would you treat them? Most of them said they would treat them. Whoa. Would you refer? Oh, they were all going to refer. And they were all going to refer to a psychiatrist, except for one person who referred to a psychologist.
Yeah.
And in the after-death communication sample, one person, I gave them the choice of referring to a chaplain on every one of these. One person thought of sending the after-death communication person to a chaplain.
Fascinating.
And
I wouldn't have thought
it's-
stigma would affect that so much.
Oh, it's amazing, and
Like
it's clear.
today, I don't know.
It's clear that the military providers are much more ignorant of this than civilian clinicians. Now, I would say, especially at least for near-death experiences, that's become relatively well known
Yeah.
in the general population. But all three of these were, in the mid-1970s, being consistently used to diagnose psychotic illnesses.
Right.
And in fact,
It takes a while to reduce the stigma from.
yeah, one of my colleagues who worked with me on this study, the head of the Institute at Medical University of South Carolina, did a survey of the professional psychiatrists in the U.S., members of the American Psychiatry Association. He sent an actual case of one of his subjects, a veteran who had had the sleep paralysis experience, with the presence. And only about 20% of those people said it's some kind of weird sleep disorder. The rest chose a psychotic illness. Most of them said this sounds like schizophrenia.
Wow.
In terms of the after-death communication in 1974, that was the cardinal symptom of psychotic grieving. Having a hallucination of the dead person, believing it's real, and then, if they're communicating with it, that's really bad. That's what it says in the textbook. Come up to 1980, that's changed completely, and now it's called the normal hallucinations of grief.
A little
Kind of
better.
silly, a little better, yes, not what the people who have them call them. But anyhow, so the stigma does real harm, and ignorance does real harm.
Right.
You have to consider the near-death experiences and the bereavement experiences have all been shown to produce better psychological health, psychological and social health.
Right.
The first physician to do a survey of the bereavement visits, a guy named Rees in Wales, published it in The Lancet. Much of this stuff is published in the medical journals. It's kind of weird because you would think that would have more impact. But at any rate, he published his study in The Lancet, and he found that over 60% of the widows and widowers in the county where he practiced, when asked what was the most helpful thing to you in dealing with your grief, said visits from my deceased spouse.
Wow.
He didn't expect that. He didn't ask about it. He thought, well, like maybe neighbors visiting or, having family around. But the number one thing was visits from the deceased spouse. And he's followed this. He is now a hospice physician. This was like 40 years ago. And he's been able to say that for many of these folks, the relationship with the deceased persists. And you will see, even in the modern psychiatric literature, it says that these are normal, especially shortly after the death.
Right.
Because people sort of expect, like, well, they're all upset at that point.
Well, Richard, you've had experience with that back when you were working at Caronwood Village and talking to people. Remember
When
that
I
one
was
woman?
there's Caronwood Village, an old folks home here in town. There were a bunch of people that I would talk to, and there was one woman that I was talking to, and she talked about her husband passing away a bunch of years ago, and I said something along the lines of like, "Oh man, that must be really hard. You must miss him a lot." And she's like, "Well, yes and no. We talk every night." And I was kind of taken aback because it's just,
Yeah.
We're ready for that as an answer.
Yeah, although I believe that is possible, there is. I'm always sort of like a very open-minded skeptic.
Yeah.
I
Even though
would
you're
call myself.
theological school.
I always am frustratingly skeptical, and I think it's just because if you're not having that experience, it feels so different from your reality. It's
Yeah.
hard to accept that that's
Right.
even possible.
Yeah, I've
which
never
ties
had
back to
that.
people in the first place having sleep paralysis or night terrors not wanting to share it because they're like, how could anyone else comprehend my experience? Because no one else is having this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So hearing that from someone, would for sure make you be taken aback.
Yeah. And unfortunately, that same reaction happens very frequently among the family of subjects who then go to the doctor and say, I think that mom needs some medication because she's starting to talk to people who aren't there,
Right.
Which just by itself sounds kind of bad. But Reese found that the people who had these experiences lost less weight, had less trouble sleeping, were less grieved, handled their grief more easily.
Could cope.
They could cope. And as I said, some of them last for quite a long time, even for many years. And they also they have some interesting relationships. I could see this in the data from the combat vet study between the after-death communication and near-death studies, understandably, because during a near-death experience, people very often encounter deceased loved ones. And in my own family, it's not exactly encountering a deceased loved one, but my dad died of Alzheimer's disease, and he and my mom lived at my home at the end of their lives. And Dad was no longer able to speak. But you often get, with dementia and Alzheimer's, something called terminal lucidity, which I tend to think has a spiritual component, but that is people who couldn't speak and didn't understand what was going on before suddenly seem to be able to maybe talk a little bit, seem to understand, seem to say things to the family and stuff, and then they're ready to go.
Last hurrah, kind of.
Yeah. My mother had a near-death experience in the 1970s while under treatment for a heart condition. In response to a medication, she she probably didn't have cardiac arrest, but she had a pretty severe cardiac episode that caused her to lose consciousness and have difficulty breathing or possibly stop breathing briefly. Immediately, because she was in a medical setting, she was under care immediately, she remembers it very clearly, as near-death experienced people generally do. She saw them coming in, trying to revive her, taking her down to the coronary care unit. She had an unusual experience in that in the coronary care unit, when she was resuscitated, her viewpoint came back to here, but what she called her real self was still back where the viewpoint had been. And for the next several days, including after discharge, she felt, it's like people feeling a presence, but the presence she was feeling was herself. She didn't tell anybody that. And talking to her and my dad afterwards, my dad said she'd been pretty quiet, but he thought she was okay. He didn't really know anything was going on. They went out for a ride in the car a few days after she was discharged from the hospital, and as she described it to me, and it took me 6 months to drag this out of her. I knew, she said, boy, during that crisis, I had something really strange happen. I'll never tell anybody, she said.
She said that?
Yeah.
Oh,
I said, come on,
crazy.
Mom, you got to tell me. And anyway, 6 months later, she did tell me the thing that had happened, which was they're driving down the road, and up in the sky, she sees something coming toward the car. And as it got closer, she saw that it was a crowd of people. And she could recognize them when they got closer. They were all people she knew who had died.
Oh, my goodness.
And she said there were no words exchanged, but she knew what they were thinking. They knew what she was saying. They had come to ask if she was ready to go, and that she would go with them. And she said she stopped and thought about it for a while, and she had the impression that there was something important that she had not done, although she didn't know what it was. And she said they understood, and they went back. And the next morning when she woke up, she said she felt great. That thing back there was inside again, and she was set to go. And for the next few years, she would give me a call every now and then saying, I woke up this morning, I was thinking about that. I think maybe it was I'm supposed to do this, and she would do something nice for somebody in the family. And then my dad was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, and she said, that's it. She was heroic, and she kept him at their home for years, and then finally, when it was just impossible, Dad was over 6 feet tall, Mom was just over 5 feet tall. It was amazing that they didn't break more bones than they did with her trying to steer him around. But at any rate, she took great care of him, and she saw that as her mission.
A strong woman. Wow.
She absolutely. As he approached death, he did start to become more lucid. And in fact, my mom and I were standing next to him. It was the day before he died, and he looked at the two of us, and then he reached up and took my hand. We had our hands on the rail of the hospital bed. He took my hand and put it on hers. It gave me a smile. I felt like it was sort of an assignment he was giving me, So anyway, the next morning, Mom woke up early, probably around 5 o'clock, and heard him stop breathing. And what do you think she did? She had a long conversation with him because she knew where she had been when she stopped breathing. And she thought, well, now he can understand me, and he didn't talk back. I mean, she didn't see him.
Right.
But her experience of the near-death experience changed her experience of his death
Right.
in a really cool way.
That's incredibly powerful.
And this is I mention this because this is part of the harm that's done by the stigma and the suppression of knowledge about this. You don't have to have the experience yourself to hear about it and reach conclusions about how you can and should relate to death, loss, pain, all of these kinds of things. And in fact, I had that experience of telling mom and dad's story at conferences in a few places. In one place, it was a place where my host's father in a nursing home died during the conference, and his adult daughter, came and told me afterwards that he had told them my mom's story that I had told, to the audience. And so she had that story, and then the next day she went to the nursing home with her 5-year-old son, and they walked into Pop's room, and he had died. Nobody had found him dead. He had died probably just an hour or so earlier. And instead of that being a horrible, grotesque experience, she turned to her son and said, remember what your grandfather told me about that man who's giving the talk and what his mother found. And so we know that Pop is probably still in the room up there, and we can have a talk with him. We can say goodbye. And they were able to simply step onto the ground that Mom and Dad had been on and enjoy and use that experience. There are the ramifications of being able to take these things seriously and share them, I think, are huge. And the harm done by the stigma and the suppression, preventing people from, not only preventing them, but gosh, to take something like the bereavement experience or near-death experience and diagnose a psychotic illness on that basis, give people hallucinogenic drugs that put them into kind of a stupor state to stop these experiences as if they were bad.
Right.
It's stunning. It's amazing, especially when you think that we used to, a few hundred years ago, even in the West, know all about these things. Swedenborg.
And encourage those kind of things.
And encourage them.
Yeah.
That's true. And
to
think that it's rational or more rational to dismiss these things despite all of the empirical data. I mean, we had to shovel up, pile, and throw away tons of data to get from where people were in the 16th century to where they were in the 19th century on calling all of this nonsense.
Right.
I think.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to thank you for first sharing your personal story. That was incredibly captivating and touching to hear about your family. So thank you for that, and thank you for all the tireless work you've done in reducing this stigma. Because releasing your book has paved way for more studies to do, and I'm sure conversations like these, just personally that you've had with people, beyond just your study work, has gone a lot.
I get letters and emails from all over the world from people saying thank you for taking seriously this thing that happened to me.
I believe it.
That I'm not crazy.
I imagine that's hard to find in the scientific field. And hopefully getting less hard to find day by day.
I hope. Well, there are a lot of really, really good researchers on particularly near-death experience. People generally speaking, are not all that interested in getting into the horrible evil of sleep paralysis. But near-death experiences and after-death communication, they are. And there are lots of wonderful, really good people doing this work and doing it for a good reason. Like Bruce Grayson in the near-death experiences is a terrific leader. And Reese, who informed the world. Okay, this is not psychotic. This is good for you.
Right.
And be happy when your grandmother tells you that she's talking to your dead grandfather.
Yeah, don't be scared.
Don't be scared.
And on the point of the kind of improvement of mental state and physical health from these positive near-death experiences, I just sort of had curiosity. Have you looked into any sort of negative effect of negative spiritual experiences on people?
Well,
we do see the positive spiritual effect from positive spiritual experiences.
Yeah.
The only negative
It's in reverse.
spiritual experience I really have a lot of knowledge of is the sleep paralysis with the presence.
But does that have an ongoing sort of effect?
No. Now, if it happens to them a lot, it's a serious annoyance. I've known some people who have had that as often as once or twice a week for most of their lives, and have sought medical help for it, and nobody knows exactly why it would be that common. It doesn't go with a disease,
Right.
but it's a peculiar thing. But they're okay during the day, but for most of them, it doesn't stop being terrifying when it's happening. So they would like to make it stop. For those people who want to know if that's happening to them, how to make it stop, don't lie on your back. 80 to 90% of these things happen to people lying on their back. I have some theories about it, but we don't really know why that would be. And the other thing I tell people is every tradition has remedies for protecting you from evil. Find out what your tradition says and do it.
Yeah. Or try something different.
Or
If you
try
don't have a
something different.
tradition.
I have a story for you on that.
Quick tangent, go for it.
Yeah, okay. I'll just, to finish on the sleep paralysis, like if Catholics usually put rosaries under their pillows, that helps, or holy water, and just people use the stuff that they use.
Yeah.
Okay, this is my wife's great-grandmother, her grandmother, who was almost 100, lived with us at the end of her life. And one morning, it was a Memorial Day because I was home from work, and this was long before I retired. And I was walking past her bedroom, and she called me in, and she said, "David, I couldn't get a wink of sleep all night because there were people coming in and out of my room." And I said, "Oh." And she said, "I know there were spiritual people because they weren't coming in and out through the door." And I said, "Okay."
Did you freak out, or how were you taking it?
No. I thought, okay, I've heard things like that before.
Yeah.
And so I said, "I'll come back and check on you later." And I came back, and she said, "They're still bothering me." So she was Catholic, so I had some holy water. I sprinkled holy water, and she said, "They're still coming around, David." And I had a student who had just come back from doing field work out west on the Sundance, who had given me a smudge. You know what smudges are?
I don't know.
This was a sage smudge, dried, bound up, and then you get it lit, and then you blow out the flame, and it's like incense.
Yeah.
So I thought, I don't know how to use this, but I think this is the kind of thing people use it for. So I called up my student and I asked, "Yeah, that's what you use it for. Here's how you do it." And so I went back and I said, "Now, a lot of, this is something that Native Americans do, and they say this is really helpful in cases like this. You want to try it?" And she said, "Sure, anything to make this stop." And so I did it. I opened a window, and I got it going, and I went around 4 times. And she said, "David, the moment that smoke got near them, they were gone." And they didn't come back. But a week later, I was walking down the same hallway, and she called me in, and she said, "There are people coming again." And I said, "Shall I get the smudge?" And she said, "No, this is my mother and sister, and I think they're here for me." And she died the next day.
Wow.
But I was so impressed. I was impressed by her family coming for her. I was impressed by the Native American strategy, making the nasty people go away. The nasty people were people she recognized from her childhood who had been bad to her family.
My step great grandfather, who I never had the privilege of knowing, but he was actually a combat veteran. His plane got shot down in, I think it was World War II. He was taken captive. Long story short, managed to escape, stumbled out into a field, and was taken in by these two people who owned a farm, especially this woman who owned the farm, and nursed him back to health and cared for him and gave him food and shelter and gave him like an escape route, basically, to get back to safety. And he always remembered these people, never met them again. And then when he was on his deathbed, and what they later found out was, hours from passing, he said, "She's here." And he described the same woman that nursed him back to health after he was shot down and escaped a concentration camp, came for him.
Yeah.
And it's so beautiful.
Yeah, if I had another 25 years of research ahead of me, which I probably don't, I would turn to that. That's the class I would like to do next. That are called end-of-life experiences. And the frequency with which people come to take away the dying is high. And it's
well, I think there's something
beautiful.
Beautiful. And I think there is something spiritual about people having that subtle transition to being ready for the afterlife. Instead of me just sitting here, being very present on earth and with everyone here, and then boom, next moment I'm in the afterlife.
Yeah.
It's in best case scenarios with people of old age passing away, a slower, gradual acceptance of where their life is headed. And I think we see that a lot from people who have these visitations.
Yeah.
And I think that's all in God's plan,
I do too. And people would feel a lot better about death and life if they could take these things seriously. Yeah, but we talked about the psychiatric stigma. I have to add that the theological rejection of these things is equally problematic.
Right.
I remember hearing a wonderful near-death experience story from a Lutheran minister who then told me, I wish I could tell my congregation about this because I bet some of them have had this too, but I'd be fired.
Isn't that tough when a church of faith background as well as medicine, doctors, they're supposed to be the two biggest places of safety and comfort for people. But in this category, it's just not at all the case.
It is not. You're going to be in big trouble.
Right.
Heresy and crazy.
Heresy and medication. Not the solution for something that's not even a problem.
No, it's just, it is terribly unfortunate.
Yeah.
I don't have a recipe for how to reintegrate these things, except I will say, because of the pastoral rejection, and look in pastoral care journals, look in theological journals, you don't find this stuff. Not even occasionally a little bit about near-death experiences, but never taken very seriously. So these are damaging to people in general. It's also damaging to religions. I mean, it is part of the huge distance between modern theology and ordinary people in their lives. And I think it's so sad. Prior to the Reformation, a lot of good things came out of the Reformation, but if you look at medieval Christianity, just as when you look at other religions around the world, which didn't pass through that period in European culture, the world was overfilled in some ways. I mean, with spiritual realities. Of course, you got the burning of innocent people as witches and all kinds of bad stuff that comes from that. But that doesn't make the fundamental issues different. I mean, it really just is kind of like, I guess, the way political and other social movements, whatever's happening around here, they will take advantage of it and put it to their purposes, nefarious very often. So maybe it's natural that these things are returning to modern culture outside of churches. You know, you see it on TV, you read about it in Reader's Digest. Now you're able to hear about it from people down the street. It is returning, but sort of you might almost call it more like folk tradition, although there's a lot of scientific research involved that underlies the growing interest. But boy, you think of what religions say they're about, and then you think about this stuff. And when you know how common, I mean,
Yeah, saying
It's
their
not just
expertise
these-
in the afterlife,
Yeah.
in the spiritual world, but you
Yeah.
can't even meet people where they
Yeah.
are with these spiritual
yeah,
experiences.
you want to teach people about the afterlife, but you don't want to talk to them about any of this.
I actually had a
Teach, not
fascinating
learn.
conversation. I had a fascinating conversation with an evangelical Christian a while back, and someone who's very staunch in their belief and lives that every day. And I asked what I thought was a simple question of, oh, well, so you die, you wake up in heaven, what's it like? It's just so hard for them to answer.
Yeah.
Like they just didn't have a clear picture. And it kind of threw me a little bit because I was like, you spend so much of your time thinking about this, discussing why you believe, but you don't
Yeah.
have a clear picture of the afterlife. And,
Yeah.
and I guess
Well-
we're kind of maybe privileged from a Swedenborgian background because
Sure.
it's all about painting a very clear picture of what to expect
Yeah.
in the afterlife. You know,
Yeah.
Swedenborg, that's all his books,
Yeah.
besides his, exegesis or whatever, is all about what the afterlife is about.
Right, right.
You've been working for the past few months now in hospice, right?
I actually was waiting. I was being too timid, but it's very timely for
I
me
didn't know you were
because
working in hospice.
yeah, I've been volunteering as part of experiential learning for theological school since March, so 5 or 6 months. I've been volunteering at a hospice organization called Paralysis, and it's fascinating just how prevalent so much of this stuff is in that industry. I mean, if you talk to anybody who works in hospice, at least in my experience, they know hundreds and hundreds of times a year they see it. Right before someone passes, they will always start, looking into the corner and talking to someone.
Yeah.
And they'll describe them. And the experience that we were talking about is, the last hurrah. The way it's kind of comical and hopefully not sacrilegious. They called it the Last Supper. With a clear biblical reference,
Yeah.
as right before they die, usually the day before they die, they'll just have a ton of energy, and they'll also start seeing and speaking to, so they become more lucid, but at the same time, what most people would think of as less lucid or, seeing things or hallucinating.
Yeah.
But time and time again, I was sort of warned, don't be freaked out by it. But when you go in and someone's transitioning, they will probably start to see people and to talk to them.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating that, humanity's been dealing with death since its inception. I mean, and it's so close to us, but at the same time, we want to distance ourselves from it because it scares
It's
us.
the unknown.
Yeah.
Exactly. And if something's unknown, then you say, well, okay, if someone had a near-death experience, it might be a lack of oxygen to the brain and it's causing this or that. And, that could be true, or something else could be true, or both.
Well, lack of oxygen does not create the kind of clarity and lucidity
Right.
that's characteristic of near-death experiences.
Right.
And in fact, you have to ask, in terms of what you're describing in the hospice, why would people in the process of dying become more lucid, more energetic? Well, you do have to remember that most people in near-death experiences say that while their heart was stopped and they were out of their body, they were more lucid than they had ever been before in their entire lives. Well, that's kind of contradictory to our expectation that you need a brain in order to do thinking. But it does suggest that maybe you don't need a brain to do thinking, although I think brains are very helpful.
I'll keep mine.
Well, for now.
Yeah.
You're not
Fair
going to keep
point.
it forever.
Fair point.
But that's, the hospice and palliative care, but particularly hospice because you have a more contained environment where sort of all of now, fortunately, most of the restraints are off. At the beginning of the hospice movement, I think that it was more because people were very surprised to see what they were encountering.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful thing.
So Ben, have you had any personal experiences with that in your hospice care so far? Anyone
Well,
that has told you about an experience or had an experience?
Yeah,
when you were
I
in the room?
personally haven't had anything that really struck me. I mean, I've had some really touching experiences. Having people who are completely unresponsive and holding their hand, for 10, 15 minutes and having nothing, and then saying a prayer with them, and then finding that I literally couldn't take my hand away because they were holding it so tightly. So it's clear that something is going on, and they say that hearing is the last thing to go.
Mm-hmm.
So, whenever you approach someone who's transitioning, it might seem like they are completely unresponsive and have no idea what's going on in the surroundings.
Right.
More often than not, they actually can still hear you and know exactly what's going on, even if it doesn't seem like it.
When I was in the medical school, I mean, one of the things that when you were talking about death or people getting close to death, it was really important when people are in comas, don't feel free to talk about them in the room. People say terrible things in front of people they think are unconscious, and they may very well not only be hearing, but also may remember it later and may comment on it.
Yeah. Something I've been thinking about, and we don't have to go this direction, but in the introduction to your book, I was struck by you were talking about a couple different types of folklore. And we have all sorts of folklore, as you might call it, whether it's religious or spiritual or, something like merfolk. Sailors seeing a merman in the ocean, and how some things like that can eventually be explained away. And, oh, wow, look, we can actually reproduce this with a change in ocean temperature at the exact right angle.
That example in there,
with a thermocline.
Yeah.
And that's cool. So a question I have is, when you're studying folklore and you're studying experiences that are widespread across time and space, as you call it, and when you know that certain things probably don't exist, like a merman, they probably don't exist, and we've sort of explained it away.
It's good conspiracy theories.
Where do you draw the line between, well, okay, so we've explained away that, and a lot of modern atheists would say the same thing just about religion in general. Well, okay, we used to look up at the night sky and we didn't understand what the moon was, so we turned it into a goddess.
Right.
Now, us sophisticated folk in 2019, we know better. Where do you draw the line between experiences that eventually seem to get explained away and experiences that are just so widespread, but there seems to be really genuinely something more?
Well, the line I use, and it is the one that skeptics claim to use, but I would say they don't, and that is rigorous reasoning and demand for evidence. Now, when the after-death communications come to be called the normal hallucinations of grief. We didn't used to have normal hallucinations. There were
normal hallucinations in and of itself.
They were not good things, and they still generally seem not to be in the psychiatric view. Hallucinations seem not to be. But then some hallucinations, are good for you, or they go along with a state that's good for you. You're happier. You're more lucid, you're not paranoid, you're not, you don't have other symptoms of psychotic illness, but you're talking to people who are dead, which of course couldn't actually happen, so they still have to be hallucinations. Well, that is already on shaky ground from the skeptical point of view, but when you find out, let me give you I'll try to make it really quick. A great example, Bruce Grayson has published a couple of times a case that he was involved in of a teenage boy who had spinal meningitis and he was in a coma. They thought he might not live through the night, but he did wake up in the morning. His parents were there with him, and the father came to the doctors and said, look, he's delirious. And they said, what do you mean? And he said, well, he gave all these details, and they said, oh, that's a near-death experience. We know that happens a lot. And he said, yeah, but he said that he saw his sister Teresa there. And she's the one who told him he had to come back. When he said, "Can't you come with me?" she said, "No, I have to stay." Well, she's in Vermont in college. So, I mean, this is obviously a hallucination. Well, they get home that morning, and there's a phone call waiting for them, and Teresa's not in college anymore. She died that night in a car accident. Now, this happens remarkably often, that people in near-death experiences, often it's somebody else in the same accident where they put them in the hospital, and they'll have an experience, and they say, "Yeah, I saw Fred, and I don't know why Fred would be there. Fred's not dead. Oh, we're sorry. We didn't want to tell you until you were feeling better, but Fred died in the accident." So that's one of the many kinds of veridical perceptions that are very, very common in these experiences, where people see things that are confirmed as true that they could not have normally known. Now, the skeptic may say, well, that's going to happen 1 in a million times. It's not 1 in a million times.
Yeah.
And once, that's what I mean about having a rigorous, rational, inferential line. Once you have to start concocting very sort of unlikely to the extent of really being not plausible, except that they are materialistic, which for a lot of people makes things look plausible. That's not being rational. I say follow the evidence and be prepared to change your mind. If I had loved merfolk myself, and then when I read that article by the physicist about the explanation of the illusions created by the thermocline, I would have said, well, maybe there aren't merfolk. At least in the North Sea, merfolk that look like that are actually not merfolk.
Right.
Not sure about the others. We can wait and see. But also, you could say, well, do you have other reasons to believe in merfolk? Well, if the only thing you had for believing in them was stuff that looked like that, time to give it up.
Right.
But for the things that we see in these experiences, the prevalence, and we're talking about what are basically independent eyewitness accounts in the millions. And there are not psychiatric conditions or psychiatric illnesses that produce complex, identical, long narratives across cultures. No, that just doesn't happen. You get variation from individual to individual, from social setting to social setting. When you get these kinds of consistent agreement on the perceptual details of the experiences, and it's an experience they'd never heard of before. They didn't hear anybody else tell them this is what you'll be experiencing. Because we know suggestion can play a big role, which is why, part of the research methodology issue is that you have to be able to do cross-contextual comparisons where the different samples are more or less naive. It's really hard to do this work just in a sample where everybody there knows it. If you were to try to make a case for the reality of Swedenborgian visions, say, done entirely among devout Swedenborgians, and they were only talking about the Swedenborgian visions that Swedenborgians all know about, that would not prove that the visions are not real, but it wouldn't give you the kind of evidence that we're talking about. If you find out, and maybe we need some Swedenborgian ethnographers to do this, if you find out that Baptists and Buddhists and Hindus are having some of those same visions with the same details, maybe even including Emanuel Swedenborg occasionally, I don't know, then that would be different. So it's really, the thing is, these experiences are believed to be real by most who have them. And we expect most people to tell whether their perceptual experiences are real or not, if they're healthy. And if they think that they're real, then you owe it to yourself, if you're trying to evaluate them, to look at the evidence that might or would not, as in the case of the merfolk, support their claim that they're real.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it's, I would say that the reason I got to where I am, which is a pretty weird place, is that I am more skeptical than the people who call themselves skeptics. In fact, the idea that we have today that when we say rational, we mean explained by a material explanation, that's not rationality.
Yeah.
It's materialism, and maybe materialism turns out to be right. Doesn't seem like it to me, but that is not what makes rationality. Rationality means sound reasoning.
Ability to decipher.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming on here and talking to us. I think this was an incredibly useful conversation.
Great. Well, it's my pleasure.
Yeah. Do you guys have
what
any?
you guys are doing is so important, making religion and spirituality something that ordinary people can converse about and find interesting.
Thank you. That's pretty much precisely what we're trying to do.
Yeah, that was almost word for word our mission statement.
Yeah,
so
good.
Have you seen their intro?
No?
Yeah. So
well, yeah.
thank you so much.
This was. Oh, I could talk about this for hours more. This was so fascinating to me.
Well, let's do it
Thank you
again.
so much for coming.
Yeah, well,
There's
yeah.
lots more.
We would
Do you-
love
do
to
you-
have you back sometime.
Would you like to plug anything? Do you want to say your book?
Well, I
and
meant
where
to bring the
people
book
can
because I would have loved to hold the book up because the picture on
We'll
it
show a
is-
screenshot of the
But
book.
Flashing it on
Ben,
screen right now. Future Ben. Put it on. There it is.
Yeah, Ben, put that book up there. Tell them it makes a beautiful birthday present. Cover suitable for framing.
We can link it down in the.
It's on Amazon
comments.
Books. I read
Yeah,
the intro
it
right
is.
there. So, yeah.
And actually, it's kind of surprising. It's published by an academic press in 1982. It's been in press ever since.
Oh, well, congratulations.
It continues to sell.
All right.
Wow.
Excellent.
Well, I want to close this out here. Thank you guys so much for watching and or listening to the Spiritable podcast. As always, you can find us all over social media under the tag Grand Human Project. It's our mother company of sorts. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram, Twitter not so much. And for the podcast specifically, audio, find it on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, basically anywhere you find podcasts. Go subscribe, download an episode, and please leave us a comment because we'd love to hear what you guys are thinking and maybe future episodes that you want to see.
Yeah, if you have any feedback, feel free to just leave a comment on our YouTube video, or you can send us an email at spiritablepodcast@gmail.com. You're going to have to learn that. Spiritablepodcast@gmail.com.
It's not too difficult.
I always forgot it, though.
How?
Once you're on the spot, you suddenly
Spiritable
forget.
podcast.
Okay, let's put Ben on the spot. Ben, why don't you say goodbye to everyone for us?
You're going to see me next time, hopefully. So, goodbye, and we love you.
Thanks for
Decent.
being here.